All right, everybody, I'm revved up here about this revelation that Hillary is now attacking Tulsi as a Russian asset. This was done in an interview that Hillary did with David Plouffe, who was the campaign manager for Obama's 2008 campaign, and then, of course, became this esteemed Democratic operative. So it's no wonder that Hillary chose to level that charge in a quote-unquote interview on some kind of podcast with a Democratic operative rather than with a journalist who theoretically could have pushed back on the extraordinarily defamatory allegation, although most journalists hate Tulsi as well, so probably would not have been inclined to push back. But let me just read to you what exactly Hillary said. And just bear in mind that this is now standard fare for American political discourse, given the insanity that has been cultivated around Russia paranoia, Russia gate. For years, I've long said that one of the impacts of this crazy paranoia was going to be to marginalize and stigmatize anybody who is perceived as a dissenting voice or who is seen as inconvenient, especially to the Democratic Party. And lo and behold, we now have an utterly predictable culmination of that with Hillary's rant. Here's what Hillary said. Quote, I think they've got their eye on somebody who's currently in the Democratic primary and are grooming her to be the third-party candidate. She's the favorite of the Russians. Notice Hillary couldn't bring herself to actually use Tulsi's name. She just wanted to kind of do this sinister innuendo that everybody would obviously infer right away, refer to Tulsi, but Hillary, didn't want to, be overt about it, which is kind of makes it even more sleazy. Hillary says, going on, that they, I guess referring to the Russians, whatever that means, have a bunch of sites and bots and other ways of supporting her so far. Sites and bots, wow, scary. There are sites and bots on the internet that are doing things that Hillary finds extremely dangerous. Hillary says that, and that's assuming Jill Stein will give it up, which she might not because she's also a Russian asset. Yeah, she's a Russian asset. I mean, totally. They know they can't win without a third-party candidate. Okay, so let's just be sure that everybody's aware, understands what Hillary said. She's explicitly describing Tulsi as a Russian asset because she says that Jill Stein is totally a Russian asset and Tulsi is also one. But the most egregious thing Hillary said here was that the Russians are grooming Tulsi to be a third-party candidate. So if they're grooming her, that implies that Tulsi is not acting on her own initiative. She doesn't have agency. She couldn't possibly believe that the things that she's saying or the reasons why she's running for president, it's got to be a product of this nefarious grooming campaign launched by unnamed, unspecified Russians. And you can imagine a scenario where if that garbage were asserted about any other candidate, especially a candidate who is a woman and a person of color, which Tulsi is, she's non-white and a religious and ethnic minority, the media will be up in arms. How could you say such a thing about this female non-white candidate and deny her agency in this way and suggest that she's being controlled like a puppet, as if the Russians are ventriloquists and they're pulling her strings? That's what Hillary is saying. And it's, again, such a depressingly predictable product of the climate that's been stoked around Russia now for years, where people don't even give it a second glance anymore when claims like this are leveled. And there's another irony here because Tulsi has repeatedly said that she was not She will not run as a third party candidate. A lot of her supporters will probably like her to at least consider that. But what these Democratic elites like Hillary and their media friends are doing is they're prodding her and poking her into possibly considering a third party run at this rate because she's being stigmatized to an absurd degree within the context of the Democratic primary. So voters aren't being given a fair depiction of who she is and what she represents. So is it likely that Tulsi will run as a third party candidate? I would still say no. But these kinds of attacks coming from the previous Democratic nominee are probably the most fertile fodder for making her possibly consider running as a third party nominee, depending on who the Democratic candidate is, obviously. And I just have to dwell on the word grooming because it's vague enough where you can just make that claim without really having to provide any evidence to substantiate it, because what does grooming even mean? I mean, if you're grooming somebody to do something, you're kind of like subtly shaping their attitudes and pushing them ever so slightly into different directions so as to further your own agenda. And so Hillary can just point to this kind of abstract issue of Russian bots and trolls and websites to support that claim, even though it has no bearing on reality. And then if she were to get pressed on it, she'd just say, oh, no, I'm not saying that they actually convened a meeting anywhere where Putin or one of his designates actually said, Tulsi, here is your marching orders, and here's what you must do in order to fracture the Democratic Party and make it so that Russian interests are somehow advanced within the context of the U.S. political system. Grooming is ill-defined enough where somebody like Hillary can probably get away with making such an outlandish claim. Now, Tulsi's a public figure. She's a presidential candidate, so there's going to be, of course, a lot said about her that she doesn't really have recourse to combat. But this is really approaching territory of outright defamation with malice. That if this had been done in the UK, for example, she'd probably have grounds to sue. She may have grounds to sue here. I doubt it'll happen. It'll probably be more trouble than it's worth. But that's how bad these allegations have now gotten, where everybody is so offended by the mere fact that she could appear on a debate stage that she's generated enough support where she could be among the 12 people on the debate stage, that they're throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks. And they think that this Russian puppet charge is what is most effective in tearing her down. Bakari Sellers on CNN the day of the debate. So on the very network, the host of the debate, Bakari Sellers went on a panel and said that Tulsi's a Russian puppet, or she's a puppet of the Russian government. And the host was like, I don't know, can you maybe give a little bit of evidence to establish that amazing allegation? And Bakari Sellers was like, oh, yeah, she likes Assad or whatever, as if that's at all responsive to whether it's at all justified to make that kind of claim. And remember, this is what the Democratic Party's political discourse has come to, and this kind of attack is effective because of how Democratic voters have been trained to view Russia as this all-consuming evil specter and this menace that cost Hillary the election and wants to cost the next Democratic nominee the election. So that's why Tulsi's negatives, if you look at her approval ratings within the Democratic primary electorate, her negatives are somewhat high, as she keeps creeping up in terms of positives as well. But relative to her public profile, her negatives are fairly high. And that, I think, you can owe to much of the outrageous attacks that have continued to be leveled against her, including this latest one from Hillary, which is just mind-bogglingly absurd. And the egregiousness continued when CNN asked a Hillary spokesman, Nick Merrill, to confirm whether she was referring to Tulsi, which everybody knew she was. I mean, who else could she have been referring to? But here's what Clinton spokesman Nick Merrill said in reply, quote, "If the nesting doll fits." So that's how sick they've gotten, where they're not just confirming that she was in fact referring to Tulsi, but using this kind of ridiculous Russian reference to back up the allegation. Now, I wonder if the media can get past its hatred of her, meaning Tulsi, and say, in the interest of just a modicum of fairness, in the interest of not allowing this kind of insane rhetoric to just run rampant without anything in the way of a challenge, maybe we should do basic journalistic due diligence and at least question Hillary or Hillary surrogates or anybody else who would level this insane charge on whether they can provide evidence. And no, making vague invocations of Russian bots and trolls and websites is not sufficient evidence for the notion that Tulsi is being directed or controlled by the Russian government. I mean, that should go without saying. But this doesn't even faze them anymore because of how prevalent it's been with regard to Trump and others. I mean, Jill Stein got brought up because she has been smeared and slandered along these lines too. Now, I have certain criticisms of Jill Stein and how she especially handled that recount business in 2016. I don't think that was totally above board. But Jill Stein got roped into this whole narrative of Russian interference because she appeared at one RT gala in 2015. And then, she got brought into this whole Senate Intelligence Committee investigation where she had to turn over documents. Her low-level staffers were badgered to determine whether she was part of this grand Russian plan to subvert U.S. democracy. And now, because they want that evil foil to be ever present, they want to elevate Russia as this enemy that is trying to destroy the Democratic Party, Tulsi gives them another vehicle to continue down that road. And there's not enough media pushback to really impose any consequences for this because of the overwhelmingly negative coverage that Tulsi receives from every mainstream precinct, aside from like alternative progressive media here and there, although some of them hate her too, and like her appearances on Fox News, which is a sad state of affairs. So if you want a silver lining here, the fact that Hillary out of nowhere would just rattle off this charge suggests that she views Tulsi as something of a threat. I mean, she wouldn't even mention her at all if she didn't think that there was something formidable about her or something that could potentially be dangerous about her. So that at least suggests that Tulsi's making something of an impact. I think this is possibly spurred by, in her closing statement at the debate, Tulsi said, when I look out on the American public, I don't see deplorables. I see Americans who might have disagreements. And the whole deplorables incident was among the low points of Hillary's campaign, which obviously had many low points, but that was one of them. And Hillary took that as a tax, it appears, and then went on this stupid podcast to drop this bombshell. So will there be anybody who says, hey, Hillary, you can't just do that, especially about a fellow Democrat who happens to be a female minority, although Tulsi being a female religious and ethnic minority never plays to her favor. That's only used as a shield when it's convenient for Democratic elites. Is there going to be enough of a journalistic pushback to impose any accountability for this? I would say likely not. And if so, it's just going to be so around the margins that nobody will really care. So the attacks continue. And I'm at a point now where, I might have disagreements with Tulsi on certain issues in terms of matters of emphasis, but in terms of some of the core planks of her campaign on foreign policy in particular, but not limited to that, the way in which she is just degraded and ostracized and maligned is so viscerally offensive that I am at a point where I get angry about it, and I get angry at people who, because they might also have certain disagreements around the margins, they ignore these kinds of attacks, or they even rationalize them, because this is corrosive not just vis-a-vis Tulsi, it's corrosive for the entire body politic for these attacks to be leveled. And I said this even when they were leveled falsely against Trump, because I have an enormous amount of criticisms with Trump. Do not believe that Trump should be reelected. But for the main criticism of Trump for 2+ years to have been that he was compromised by Russia, or that Russians were pulling the strings to get Trump elected and then guiding his policy in office, that was so incredibly damaging, because it implants and sort of instantiates certain modes of discourse in the body politic that can be used for all kinds of nefarious purposes. And this is one of them. And this is just such a shameful episode. And I'm going to be very keenly watching to see if anybody really calls it for what it is who is in a position of media prominence. We will have to see. And then the idea is like, what has Tulsi actually said or done? Forget the Russian bots, forget the trolls, forget that whole nonsense angle. What has she really said that is reflective of her strings being pulled by Russia? Virtually nothing. I mean, she has the most correct analysis of the Syria situation of any candidate. But if you just kind of impartially analyze what's gone on in terms of U.S. policy in Syria, that gets spun as pro-Russia because Russia, for whatever its faults, has not acted with the reckless abandon and insanity of the U.S. in regard to Syria over the past number of years. And, now Russia, took over a base that the U.S. had commanded in northeast Syria after Trump's withdrawal. And so if you express that maybe it wasn't a great idea for the U.S. to be controlling that territory in perpetuity in the first place and acting as a mediator between rival forces and funding proxies and enmeshing itself militarily in this nonstop entanglement, then if the byproduct of that is that Russia comes in and takes over a base, then you're somehow, implicitly or even explicitly seen as pro-Russia, which is just garbage. Tulsi looked at the Mueller report and said, hey, this does not actually back up the grandiose collusion claims that Democrats and the media have been making for 2+ years, and actually it's done a lot of damage. And that was pro-Russia in the eyes of many who are kind of like mindless partisan Democrats. But beyond that, what is the evidentiary basis for leveling this claim? If I had Hillary in front of me, I would make sure to challenge her on that, because it just doesn't exist. And so for Democrats not to be aware of that is really just insane. But this is just a continuation of the narrative that Hillary pushed from the day after the election, and even going before the election took place, of why she lost. She can't get over it. She thought that she was entitled to the presidency, and that the presidency was deprived of her as a result of this foreign campaign to tear her down. And she might admit faults or errors or that she wasn't perfect, but the thrust of how she explains her election loss is Russia. And anybody who seems in her mind to be a receptacle of Russian influence just reinforces how wrong she feels she was at the 2016 election. And she wants that framework to be dominant in the 2020 election as well. Even for a member of her party who is a minority woman. And it's really just bogus and sad. So we'll see how this plays out. I would expect Tulsi to come out with a statement soon. She declined comment, or her campaign declined comment to CNN when they asked her to respond to these allegations. But they're not going to play into whatever narrative CNN is trying to push. They're going to come up with something on their own accord, and I would expect that shortly. And it should be good. So we'll see, and I'll talk to you all later.